Another important term from Chapter 1 is this idea of a variable. So a variable is any characteristic of an individual, and it can take on different values for different individuals. One thing we want you to be able to distinguish in Stat 1350 is the different types of variables that we have. And there are two common types that we'll talk about in great detail in this course. So one type is a categorical variable. And with a categorical variable, you're essentially placing individuals into different groups or categories. So an example might be that I ask everyone in class, or I ask you what your favorite color is. That would allow me to put you into a particular category. I ask you what your major is. I ask you what your opinion on a survey is. I want to know what your eye color is. We can contrast that with a quantitative variable. So with a quantitative variable, we're gathering quantitative information, we're gathering amounts of something, we're gathering numerical information from individuals, and it makes sense then to average that information or to perform different arithmetic operations. So again, an example here might be I gather ages from individuals, heights, weights, how many books you read over winter break or over the summer or over spring break. In each case there, I'm gathering quantities or amounts of something. And these pictures might help you to think about this. So I really like this picture of the recycling bins as a way, or as an analogy to categorical data. So we're taking individuals and we're putting them into these different bins. We're categorizing them in particular ways. Whereas with quantitative information, we're looking at numbers, amounts of things. So the numbers that we gather stand for quantities. Now, putting all the pieces together, so let's think back to the very start of this lecture where I asked you to imagine being in a large lecture hall and gathering information from some of your peers. So who do you think in that case the individuals would have been? So again, you learned this term individuals in Chapter 1. So the individuals are the units that we're gathering data from. So in this case, they would be people, or you could say they would be students, they would be classmates, peers from Stat 1350. So there are many different ways we could talk about this. But each individual is what we're gathering information from, and here they would be people. What were the variables? So the variables in this case would be the name, major, credit, miles lived from campus, and word that comes to mind. So each of those questions you asked was getting information about a different variable. And again, the information you gathered might have been a little bit different from individual to individual. So we can also think about which variables were categorical and which were quantitative. So categorical data, placing individuals into categories, would be name, major, and that word that comes to mind. The quantitative would be credits and miles lived from campus, because again, in each of those cases, we would be gathering quantities or numerical amounts from individuals, and it would make sense then to average those amounts together to determine on average how far away did individuals live from campus. On average, how many credits are students in the course taking? To wrap things up here, it's always important once we gather data to think about the conclusions we can draw. And we're going to start to talk about this in much more detail when we get into chapters 2, 3, and 4, and many of the other chapters to come up later on this semester. So one thing I want you to think about is the fact that if you were in a situation where you had to gather some data from some of your classmates, we would consider those classmates to be a sample from a larger population. So the population might be all of the students in Stat 1350, or it might be all of the students who are taking the online section of Stat 1350. A sample is a small subset of a larger group. Now, if I only gave you about 5 minutes to meet as many classmates as possible, it's very likely that you wouldn't be able to meet everyone in the whole class. Maybe you would meet 5 or 10 of your peers. Think about what you might learn by talking to that small group of your peers. Maybe you would notice, for example, that they were all taking exactly the same number of credits. Maybe they all happened to be in the same major or very similar majors. Maybe they all lived within 5 miles of campus. So you might notice that there's not a lot of variability in terms of the responses of each person to each of the different survey items. On the flip side, you might notice lots of variability. Maybe you have somebody who lives as far away as 100 miles, and you have another person who lives as close as half a mile to campus. Maybe you have lots of different majors. Maybe the words that come to mind about statistics are all very different from each other. So when we gather a sample of data, we can look at similarities within the sample. We can look at differences within the sample. And there are ways that we can quantify that information, and you'll start to learn about that as we get closer to the midterm, as we get closer to the middle of the semester. So there are certain things that we can learn and talk about from a sample of classmates. We might also want to think about, can we take that sample and draw an inference or reach a conclusion about a larger group? So often what we do in statistics is we gather a sample of data and we want to say something not just about that sample, but about the larger group that the sample comes from. So are there things that we can say about all of Stat 1350 based on that sample that we collected? Well, maybe, maybe not. It depends on how representative that sample is of the larger group. If you're gathering data from your classmates, and let's say you decide, for convenience sake, I really don't want to get up. I just want to sit here and I want to gather information from the few students who are sitting around me. Is that going to be a representative sample of everyone in the whole lecture hall? It might be, but it also might not be. Would you do a better job if you got up and went to different places in the lecture hall, tried to get a sample of students from every possible location in the lecture hall, from the front, from the back, from the middle, from the sides? That might give you more of a representation. It's possible that people who are very similar to each other tend to sit in certain areas. So you might not be getting a good representation if you only focus on one area. So we're going to talk about, specifically in Chapter 2, lots of different types of sampling methods and why some of those methods are better than others. So I'm going to stop here, and again, we'll pick up pretty soon when we get into Chapter 2. Thank you, everyone.